Hi everyone. About a year ago, I did a video on how tanks perform in snow. That was a very general video, lots of different tanks, not really any context to it. And as if you look outside, well, depending on your location, it is that time of the year again. I've put on my special winter hat. But this time, I'd like to talk about, rather than just any tanks in snow and then how they dealt with that, I want to talk about the mobility in snow in specifically the winter of 1941. So the defense of Moscow, defense of Leningrad, kind of when things looked bleakest for the Red Army. And you can really see in a lot of German memoirs and historians who unquestioningly take those memoirs as sources is that, well, everything was going great until we hit the fall and you had all that mud, and you hit the winter and you had a lot of snow, and well, it's just not possible to fight in Russia in these conditions. Of course, you had exactly the same amount of snow and mud on the other side of the front lines, and it wasn't really some kind of coincidence or magic that the Red Army could fight in those conditions. It was the result of very in-depth study of how tanks performed in snow and in mud and all these conditions. And of course, necessary design changes were implemented as a result. So you probably, you've read about the T-34 and the KV and how well it did in snow. And I went to great lengths to talk about it in my previous video. As you could expect, white tracks, powerful engines, they can drive through snowbanks that are quite deep, over a meter deep, without really any issues. Now, unfortunately, the KV-1 and the T-34 were quite rare in the Red Army in 1941, and even at the end of 1941, as kind of the Soviet industry was just getting evacuated and then set up on its new locations. These tanks were the exception rather than the rule. And so the majority of the Red Army's tanks were either the pre-war tanks, so like the T-26 most commonly, or the T-60, which was just coming into production. The advantage of that tank, of course, being that you could produce it using automotive components at automotive factories in great numbers without really all that much downtime. The problem with these tanks is that neither of them were really all that good in fighting in winter. I covered the T-60 a little bit, but I have found new information on how this tank performed since. So as mentioned in the previous video, here's a T-60 tank. You can kind of see that very low clearance. You have about 30 centimeters of clearance, very narrow tracks. The engine's not that powerful, 70 horsepower, I believe. So these tanks, depending on the unit, depending on the conditions, I would see figures between like 30 to 40 centimeters of snow was the most they could drive in. Some units said, only 20 to 25 centimeters of snow. So, not really all that much. You even had commanders saying, well, it's better to drive through the forest rather than out in the open, because in the forest, yes, there's trees and stumps and all sorts of things getting in your way, but there's also not quite as much snow because the trees block it. So these tanks, they were very valuable in defense of Moscow because it's better to have a tank like this than no tank at all. But there were a lot of limitations about their uses, one of which specifically is, because it's hard to use them in deep snow. So the T-26, in my last video, I talked about trials of the Vickers Mark E. The Vickers 6-ton, the name is a little bit deceptive. It was closer to 7 tons by the time the USSR tested it, but during trials of that tank, it was noted that it could drive in 40 centimeter deep snow at about half of its top speed. Now, you can't really extrapolate that performance directly to the T-26 because these trials took place in 1930, and a decade had passed, and so the T-26 was, of course, improved, and as it often happens, improvements to a tank make it heavier. And so, your Vickers 6-ton by 1940, 1941 weighs, 10 tons or even more than 10 tons. There are, of course, T-26s from the early 30s still in service that are lighter, but they're quite worn out. So a lot of commanders in the winter of 1941 or even in the summer complain that, or the objectives that we get, the missions that we're given, they do not reflect the condition of the vehicles that we have to use. So these tanks are they're more worn out, they're weaker, and this is reflected in their performance in snow. So reports say that whereas, your Vickers Marquis could drive in 40 centimeters of snow at half speed, 40 centimeters of snow for T-26 is pretty much the limit. It can barely drive through that, not much more. So better than a T-60, but not really much better. So one of the other disadvantages of the T-26 is that the track design wasn't particularly great, and what you would get is fairly low traction, and that's another one of the things that commanders complained about, is tanks can't drive up iced slopes, and there were never really any grousers developed for it. There are actually some projects for new tracks, either wider or improved in different ways, that for the T-26 that were carried out. None of them were really put into production. You can read about it on my blog. There's a link in the description. But the T-26 went into the Great Patriotic War pretty much with the same tracks that it had, the decade before, which wasn't great. One of the things that crews would actually do is they would take the track, 2 or 3 track links per track, and they'd flip them. So the guide horns would be used as these sort of ersatz grousers. That helped. But commanders still say that the traction is not enough, the engine power is not enough on these old worn out tanks. They can't really climb in winter, and they can't really go off road, either because the snow is too deep, or in some cases, especially around Leningrad, the swamps don't freeze in the winter. So there were complaints that we drove off the road. The road was blocked for some reason. We drove off the road. Tank sinks up to its turret. It's a write-off. Not that the swamps around Leningrad were a good tank country for any other tank, but in other terrain, if the T-34 KV can drive off the road in the snow at least, T-60s, T-26s, these lighter tanks can follow in the kind of the packed snow road that it creates. But as you can kind of see, on their own, the Red Army's light tanks were not really all that well suited to winter warfare. So there were other new tanks in the Red Army in the winter of 1941-42, and these are, of course, British tanks. British tanks came in as a part of British military aid, commonly incorrectly referred to as Lend-Lease, and they did actually make it in time to fight in the Battle of Moscow. By late November, early December, you kind of had them reaching frontline units, and of course they also had to negotiate this kind of snowy and muddy conditions. And usually people just write them off. They say, oh, British tanks, they're made for warm climates, they aren't suitable for use in winter. We'll compare them to T-34s, and of course the T-34 having much wider tracks, much more powerful engine, much higher clearance, performs much better in the snow than a Valentine or a Matilda would. But as you can kind of see, if you compare this 16-ton Valentine to a 26-ton T-34, that's not really maybe a very fair comparison. If you compare it to these lighter tanks like the T-60 and T-26, then they're a little bit on more even grounds. So what they found in the winter of 1941-42 is that the Valentine and Matilda could drive in 40 to 45 centimeter deep snow, fairly comfortably, so not very quickly, but again, these aren't fast tanks to begin with. They could drive in second gear for the Valentine and third gear for the Matilda. So again, not exactly speed devils, these infantry tanks, and that doesn't work out to a very high speed, but they have some reserve. If they've hit more difficult conditions, you could shift down to first or second gear and kind of make your way out of it. Whereas the T-26 didn't really have any reserve whatsoever in those depths. Some units did say that these tanks could drive through snow up to 80 centimeters deep. Those must have been some very favorable conditions, but again, they're not. You hear kind of these tanks discounted a lot for winter warfare or completely unsuitable. Wasn't exactly the case. The Valentine and the Matilda, despite some disadvantages, did drive better than the T-60 and T-26. One of the ways, complaints about these British tanks is that their tracks were not suited for icy roads, so they would slide down. There's a famous picture of Matildas that have slipped off the road and are just kind of lying in the ditch with their tracks up. That is kind of, yes, that was the case. You had some drivers who weren't used to maybe these tanks and their specifics, and so came off the road. That's not to say that didn't happen with the T-26 or some other Soviet tanks. When you compare the actual performance, so Soviet crews did say that, okay, well, the Matilda and Valentine, they're bad at climbing. They're bad at climbing slopes. In the winter, they can only handle 20 to 25 degree slopes on ice. But, as you recall, well, so was the T-26 and so was the T-60. So the same units would say, all right, the Valentines that we got, they can climb up to 20 to 25 degree slopes. The T-60s that we have can climb 15 to 20 degree slopes. So, performance of the British tanks was maybe less than ideal, but the performance of the T-60 tanks was, even worse. So then again, T-60 is a 6-ton tank. Valentine is a 16-ton tank. They're not exactly in the same weight class, but if you're comparing, if you're saying, would you rather have a different tank than a Valentine or a Matilda? Well, you're not going to get a T-34 in exchange. You're probably going to get a British tank or, later on an American tank. One of the big disadvantages, of course, of the Matilda was these side skirts. And you can't really do anything about that, right? It's an integral part of the tank, but snow gets packed in under there, and you have these kind of slots for mud to get squeezed out that, well, they sort of worked, but they don't really work for snow and ice, and it all gets packed in there, and if it melts a little bit and then refreezes, it locks the track in place. Big disadvantage of the Matilda, the Valentine didn't have any such disadvantage, so that's one of the reasons why Soviet crews prefer the Valentine. Another reason was the tracks. So on the Matilda, the traction was not as good as some Soviet tanks. Grousers were designed, I believe, for the Valentine and put into action. I don't think the Matilda ever got them. But still, its ability to drive through deep snow, its ability to climb slopes was better than, not a T-34 or a KV-1, but if you're comparing it to a T-26 or like a T-60, it was, still quite competitive, ironically. So there you have it. The snow and ice encountered in the winter of 1941-42 wasn't really, the Red Army wasn't really all that immune to it, like German memoirs would suggest, and there was a lot of study of how these conditions affected Soviet tanks or other tanks used by the Red Army, and quite a sober evaluation of how foreign tanks and domestic tanks performed in these conditions.